Alright, so this is just going to be a quick review of the study guide for Exam 3. Exam 3 is going to have the same format as Exams 1 and 2. It'll be multiple choice, true, false, and matching, and it will cover the information from this section of the class, which would be attention and memory, advanced cognitive processes, and classroom assessment. So, I'm just going to go through here and hit the highlights, but if you have questions, as always, feel free to email me. So when we were talking about attention and memory, we said that this was related to an information processing approach. The basic idea is that when it comes to our cognitive processes, we are in some ways similar to a computer. We would have an input, we would have to store information for an appropriate amount of time, and then we would need to be able to retrieve that information and do something with it, manipulate it, use it. Now we talked about how attention, specifically, first of all, we talked about how our cognitive development allows for increased attention, but it does for memory as well. When we're talking about cognitive development, it's going to be closely tied with our biological development. So things that allow for increased attention and memory, the cognitive skills also have a great deal to do with the biological development. So things like pruning of synapses, pruning of connections that are not being used, as well as things like myelination. So we talked about how in our nervous system, our neurons, the axon part of the neuron is coated in a myelin sheath, and that this is a process that continues through adolescence. And so as our neurons become increasingly myelinated, that increases the speed of our mental processing. We also talked about how the frontal lobe continues to develop as well. So some of the terms that we talked about, automaticity just refers to being able to do something without having to give a lot of cognitive resources to it. So for example, the first time you ever drove a car, it might have been challenging for you, but the more experience you have, you get to a point where it is possible to leave a location and get home and not remember the drive because it seems like your brain was almost on autopilot. Kind of scary, but many of us have had that experience. All right, metacognition. When we're talking about metacognition, this is our thinking about our thought processes. We also talked about something like meta-memory, so it's what we think about our memory abilities. So when it comes to metacognition, basically what we're doing here is evaluating whether or not what we're doing is working, and then being willing to make adjustments. So we could encourage this in our students by having them look at the way they're studying, for example, or look at the way they're approaching a problem and try to decide, is this actually working for me? Do I have good results from approaching the problem this way? So having them pay attention to their own strategies, basically. All right, we talked about different types of attention, about how we can have divided attention, where we're trying to pay attention to multiple things at once, which is not ideal for studying. We talked about selective attention, where we're able to kind of zone in on what's important and escape from distractions. We talked about being able to sustain attention over a long period of time, executive attention when we're making decisions and solving problems and keeping track of different aspects of the situation at once. So, how do we encourage attention in our students? So, we're going to talk about cognitive things here, but also in the next section of the class, we're going to be talking about how to reinforce good behaviors. And so when you see students who are paying attention, reinforcing that is a good way to encourage the entire class. Of course, you can also punish students who are not paying attention, but oftentimes we prefer to use reinforcement whenever possible, but that's just a little preview of the next section. But as far as cognitive things, giving students a break so that they don't have to sustain their attention for an excessive period of time, using some kind of cue to let students know when particularly important information is coming, mixing up the way you teach things, so teaching the same concept in several different ways can also be helpful, using technology, and some of the things that you guys talked about in your activities about attention as well. All right, so like we said with our information processing approach, we have to, specific to memory here, encode information. We have to get it in, we have to store it, and then be able to retrieve it and do something with it. So at any point during this process, our memory can break down. So it could be that we didn't pay enough attention, and so it either was not encoded or it was encoded in a wrong form. Or we could have difficulty storing it. We get it in, but we lose it before we can use it. Or with retrieval, it's there, but we have a difficult time retrieving it. So we can have a problem at any step along the way. We talked about the Atkins and Shiffrin model. Basic idea, everything that comes in contact with your senses comes into sensory memory. So it has a large capacity, but an extremely brief duration. I'm talking about maybe a few seconds or less. Then, if you pay attention, information moves into short-term memory. If you don't pay attention, everything else is lost. Now, short-term memory has a limited capacity, 5 to 9 items for most people. And then it also has a limited duration, maximum of 30 seconds. Now, when it talks about ways to keep information in short-term memory, rehearsal is what we're looking for here. If you rehearse information over and over again in your brain or out loud, it will stay in your short-term memory until you stop rehearsing it or until something distracts you. Now, we want to try to get information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory, because long-term memory is the goal. Long-term memory has the largest capacity and the largest duration. So ways to get information into long-term memory. We talked about elaboration, adding details, making it personal, and come up with your own examples. We talked about organizing information in a way that makes sense for you. I also recommended things like start studying earlier, space out your studying. Don't just read the information, but test yourself. And that way it'll actually give you a chance to practice retrieving the information instead of just looking at flashcards, that kind of thing. All right, the serial position effect, the basic idea is that when we're trying to pay attention, we usually keep the first few things and the last few things, and we lose the things in the middle. We usually remember the first few things because we've been rehearsing them, so they get a little bit of extra attention, but at a certain point we get to where we can't keep all that information in our short-term memory anymore. We can't rehearse all of it, and so we lose some in the middle, and then we come back towards the end and we still have sensory memory, so we can still remember those last few seconds of what we heard a person say. So if I called out a list of words, people usually can remember the first words and the last words. They might also remember words that are distinctive. If I sneak a word into the middle that is vastly different from the other words in the list, then they might remember that particular word just because it was distinctive. So then in a classroom setting, you might think about reviewing information at the beginning of lecture or at the end of lecture. At the beginning of lecture, you might review something from the last class period. Obviously, at the end of a lecture, you could kind of review what you covered that day. But then you could also think about ways to make the middle more distinctive, or giving students a break so that when they come back, their attention is fresh and so they don't miss as much in the middle. Recall versus recognition, these are different types of memory tests. So a recall test is one where you have to produce the answer yourself, like for example, an essay question or fill in the blank, assuming that you don't have a word bank. On the other hand, recognition means the answer is in front of you. You just have to recognize which one is the correct answer. So something like multiple choice or matching would be examples of recognition tests. And I talked about study tips. That kind of goes along with getting information into your long-term memory. All right, advanced cognitive processes. We talked about concepts, about basically we are grouping things together that go together based on similar characteristics. And so we talked about how to use things like visual representation, like a concept map, how to help our students link a new concept with concepts they already understand. We talked about giving them chances to practice. So if we are talking about, for example, a certain type of animal, if we clearly define what makes that animal a reptile, for example, then we introduce a new animal. We have our students make hypotheses about whether this animal belongs with the reptiles or not, that kind of thing. We talked about different types of thought, and specifically we talked about inductive versus deductive reasoning. So with deductive reasoning, you start with a rule that is generally true, and then you apply it to particular specific situations. So if you say, all reptiles have scaly skin, then my snake is a reptile, so my snake must have scaly skin. So you start off with a general rule, and then it tells you something about a specific case. Now, assuming that your general rule is correct, deductive reasoning may work out well for you. On the other hand, inductive reasoning means you go from one specific example to generalizing that to other people or to other situations. So, for example, if you have a bad experience with a psychology class, then you might say all psychology classes are awful. Please don't say that. Surely we have some redeeming qualities, but no, it's just an example. Maybe I talked about how my daughter has red hair. Maybe you know someone who has red hair and that person has a feisty personality, and so then you assume that everyone who has red hair has a feisty personality. It is certainly not always accurate to go from one specific example and then generalize that to other examples. So be cautious with this. This is how stereotypes can form. All right. With critical thinking, we're basically talking about being able to do our own research and decide whether or not the information we're presented with is accurate. Being able to do something with the information, not just memorizing it and spitting it back out on a test, but looking into it and finding out more. How can we encourage this in our students? Well, a lot of this just has to do with modeling it for them, first of all, because students may not have seen this before. And then working with them in tasks that require critical thinking. Maybe have them work together in groups, have people with different perspectives, different points of view, working together. Show students how to do research, how to critique research. And if you can't find the research out there, then teach them to have the initiative to do it themselves and look into it further. All right, decision making, which is similar to problem solving. Basically, when you have a decision that you need to make, you want to try to avoid some of the errors that can come up when you're making a decision. So we talked about, for example, a confirmation bias where you only look for evidence to support the decision that you're already leaning towards. We talked about belief perseverance. So if you have a decision you would like to make, then you might ignore the evidence that says you're wrong and then stick to the belief that you already have, even if you can't find much evidence for it. You can also have a hindsight bias where perhaps you feel like you knew the right answer all along. That's not good, because if we think back to metacognition, we might think that our strategies worked for us because things worked out well, but it could be that the next time you try that strategy, it could blow up in your face. So we need to be able to try to see how successful our decision-making strategies are so we can switch things up in the future if we need to. All right. Convergent versus divergent thinking, really the difference is, are we trying to zero in on one correct answer, or is it possible that there are many correct answers? So with convergent thinking, you start off with maybe several potential answers and you narrow it down to a specific right example. So maybe thinking about a multiple choice test where you rule out answers until there's only one left. On the other hand, divergent thinking is thinking outside of the box. This is the one that is related to creativity, and so this would be producing several different possible solutions to the same problem. And then from that point, you might want to go with your decision-making skills, your problem-solving skills, to see which one of the solutions helps the most. But this is thinking outside of the box and coming up with creative new solutions. All right, with problem-solving, basically what you're going to do, define what the problem is, come up with a comprehensive list of potential solutions, regardless of whether they seem valid at the time. Just brainstorm all the potential solutions you can think of. After that, you want to go through and try to look for potential benefits to each solution as well as potential drawbacks. You want to make an educated decision about which answer seems to be correct, and then you also need to be prepared that if that doesn't work, to go back to the drawing board and choose another answer. So we talked about obstacles here. Sometimes we have emotional issues that make this hard. If we're angry, if we are anxious, if we're depressed, if we're impulsive. Sometimes we don't have the motivation to get started solving the problem, or sometimes we start solving the problem and we give up on it too soon. Sometimes we feel like we have to approach a problem in a certain way and we become fixated on it, and then we can't really be open to other potential solutions. So try to avoid those. And the last thing in this lecture was about transfer, which is the goal of education, to be able to use what you're learning in a new setting. Near transfer would be using it in a very similar setting. Far transfer would be using it in a very different setting. Low road transfer means it's easy for you. It doesn't require a lot of cognitive abilities. High road transfer means that it requires a lot of cognitive effort. So the first time you're trying to transfer information from the classroom to a real life setting, it may be high road, it may be hard, but then after you practice, it tends to become more low road. All right? The last section we talked about in the third section of the class was classroom assessment. So basically our goal here is to try to understand whether or not learning has taken place in our classroom. So we are going to have different types of assessment. Pre-instruction, just like the name sounds, would happen before you teach. This can give you a baseline, gives you information about what level of ability you have in a student or in a classroom. You probably would not grade this. This would be for your own personal information, but you can then later on refer back to the pretest to see if students have gained in their understanding. Formative assessment happens while you're teaching, so the students are not super familiar with the concept yet. We're still practicing it, so we're going to have some actual hands-on practice. This could be something you grade, but it could also be something you do just to give you information about how well your students are understanding. So summative assessment is typically where the majority of your grading is going to come in. And summative assessment is going to happen after the student has learned the information. So this is what you think of as your traditional test. If you have exam 3 coming up in educational psychology, that's going to be a summative assessment of the material for exam 3. All right. Learning targets, just like it sounds, you set goals for what you want your students to be able to accomplish. You do this so that you make sure that you are using your classroom time wisely. So the vast majority, if not everything that you do in the classroom, should tie back to your learning targets. But it also helps you make decisions at the end of a semester or the end of a year about whether or not your students have successfully learned what it was that you set out to teach them. We want to make sure that our assessments are valid, reliable, and fair. You should be familiar with validity or accuracy, as well as reliability or consistency. Fairness refers to making sure that everyone in the class has an equal opportunity to be successful on an assessment, and part of this might harken back to our earlier lecture on types of learners, that some students might need extra time to take tests or a distraction-free environment in order to really show what they know about the material. All right, now different types of tests. Selective response items are questions where you have to choose from the answers that are listed. So when we think back to our types of memory, this would really be a recognition test. So things like multiple choice, things like matching, true, false would also fall in this category. On the other hand, a constructive response item would be an item where you have to produce the answer yourself. This would be recall memory. And so this would be things like essay, fill in the blank, without a word bank, short answer, that kind of thing. So we talked about different types of questions. We gave some advice for how to write them. Basically, with things like multiple choice and true, false, you can use a lot of questions because they don't take very long to answer. So you can measure several different concepts. On the other hand, with an essay question or short answer question, you're not able to use as many questions, so there may be some concepts that are not included on your test. Multiple choice and true, false, those kinds of tests are obviously a lot easier to grade versus essay questions that take a lot longer. Also, the grading is a little bit more subjective with essay questions, so the teacher has to make some judgment calls, whereas with multiple choice, true, false, matching, there's a key. However, with multiple choice, true, false, matching questions, there are certain thought processes that you really can't measure with those. Some more complex problem-solving things that you can really assess better with essay questions. And then also, although multiple choice kinds of tests are easy to grade, they take a lot longer to write because there typically are many more questions. In addition to the questions, you have to also write the answer choices. All right, purposes of grading. Certainly there are issues sometimes with the way that we do grades, but it is hard to imagine not using grades in the classroom. Grades give motivation to a student to try to be successful. It gives a student feedback on how successful they are, perhaps compared to their peers. It also gives the teacher information about how well the students are understanding the material and whether a teacher needs to go back and review certain topics, whether students are understanding. It's also helpful for things like determining who gets scholarships or who gets placed in advanced placement classes, that kind of thing. We talked about different types of grading. Criterion reference grading is where an individual is graded based on a key. So the key is 100%, basically, the right answers, and you're compared to the key to determine your grade. With norm reference grading, your performance is compared with your classmates, so that perhaps the top 5 papers get A's and the next 5 papers get B's, or so on and so forth. So actually with a norm reference system, your grade is dependent not only on your own performance, but also your classmates' performance as well. Ways to communicate grades. We talked about report cards, which oftentimes just include a letter grade or maybe even a number, but don't usually give you a ton of space to include comments. So things like progress reports, parent-teacher conferences give a teacher a chance to communicate specific information about what's going on in the classroom. Of course, these are going to be time-consuming, and you'll have to prepare for those. And we talked a little bit about how to have success with student-teacher conferences. One thing I just wanted to mention that I know I mentioned in the lecture video, but I'm pretty sure was not on the slides, that it depends on the age of the students as far as whether or not you are required or even allowed to share grade information. So if the student is under the age of 18, then the grades technically belong to the parents, unless the child is emancipated or there's some other outlier situation going on. However, with older students, their grades belong to themselves. So for example, I teach college classes. I can't share grade information with your parents if they contacted me, unless you've signed a form saying that I can do that. So you want to pay attention to the grade level of the individual, whether you actually, in the age of the individual, as far as whether you share that information with parents or not. All right, well, this was just a quick review of the study guide. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions about the material. So let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you guys when we come back to start the material for Exam 4.